Hi, Karin.
Hi.
Hi. This is a new video on qualitative secondary analysis, and we've decided to call our series "Conversations at Home" with Karin and Anna. And basically, these videos are basically a bit of an insight into the kinds of conversations that we have anyway.
Yeah.
And that have helped to produce a lot of our work and underscore a lot of our work and publications. In this video, we're going to focus on the challenges of qualitative secondary analysis. But before we do that, we ought to introduce ourselves, I guess. So I'm Dr. Anna Tarrant, and I'm an associate professor in sociology at the University of Lincoln. And I'm also director of Following Your Fathers Further, which is a qualitative longitudinal study that's examining the lives and support needs of young fathers over time. And I'm also co-author of Qualitative Secondary Analysis, which is a SAGE methods book that I've co-authored with you, Karin.
Yes. Yeah. And I am Dr. Karen Hughes, and I'm an associate professor of sociology at the University of Leeds, and I'm director of the Timescapes Archive, which is a specialist repository for qualitative longitudinal research data.
Brilliant. So in all the videos, we've sought to think through a little bit about what QSA is, how we might define it, what value it can bring to research and knowledge production. But very often in our teaching and in our conversations with people who have an interest in this work, we're actually asked, challenging questions around, what's difficult about this. And these kind of questions have dominated the debate actually around QSA for at least the last 20 years or so. And very often in the debates, the questions have focused on sort of three main dimensions. So one is epistemological. So should we do this? The second is then practical. How do we do this if we're going to do it? And then the third is around ethics. Should we be doing this? And can we engage with data if we haven't got all the ethical kind of protections and consents in place to be able to do this kind of work? We'll engage with those three areas, I think, in a lot more depth across these videos. But what we'll do in this session, I think, is just sort of really start thinking through just kind of some of the main questions that we tend to get when we're asked about doing QSA. So I guess one of the most common questions we get really is about the time that it takes to do this kind of work. There was a really interesting Twitter debate recently about, just how do we find the time to do this kind of work in a context where, there's more teaching, there's a lot more administration that we get involved with, and actually that can make it difficult to even engage with your own primary or your own data produced through primary research. We're not going to resolve any of these questions in our conversations, but again, these are the kinds of questions that we've been reflecting on, really, aren't they, and in our discussions. So we'll talk a little bit about time. QSA is a time-consuming process. It is, and we can't get away from that. Do you want to say a little bit, Karin, about why that is, and what time we need to dedicate to do this kind of work effectively?
Well, just very briefly, I've just written a lecture for some level 2 students who just being introduced to qualitative secondary analysis. And I thought I'd play around with some archives other than the Timescapes archive, because I was involved in the original Timescapes programme, where Libby Bishop was a senior archivist at the UK Data Service, and she supported the development of a lot of the archive and its functionality, because she was seconded to the Timescapes programme to develop the Timescapes archive. And then when the Timescapes ended, I was funded under Changing Landscapes, and we changed the archive again. And we were holding all these sandpits with the research team, research data leads, explaining how a researcher needs to use an archive, how they need to be able to get into the data, because you can't see what's in the data from file names, or even from simple project descriptions. So the Timescapes archive's got this really great search and browse function, which tells you you know, if you type in friendship or something like that, it'll pull up all the transcripts from across the archive that talk about friendship or benefits or going to school or whatever, any key terms, it'll pull it up.
Yeah.
But I was looking at a number of repositories yesterday afternoon, actually, which was a Sunday, which is quite sad, but there I was going through all these different repositories.
Speaking of the time of the academy.
Yeah, a little bit over enthusiastic. And I was just realizing yet again how opaque repositories are. They're just completely opaque because you know, you can have all these lovely images and little accounts and snapshots and things like that, but actually getting to data or to a data set and understanding what that data set is enormously time consuming. You've got to read a lot in just to know what's in that archive. And then you've got to read a load of stuff about that particular data set. So in the previous video, we talked about the 3 types of metadata. So that we're calling it just for the purposes of these videos. It's a useful sort of like catch-all phrase. So that the metadata are data that describe data. And so those could be all the project descriptions, you know, what the files are, you know, and you were talking about, you know, actually having the interview questions that were asked, the ethics application forms, the consent forms and information sheets and things like that. All of the project documentation are often stored and cached with the data set itself. And there are project descriptions, who was involved in it, why they did it, who funded it, what were the, you know, what were the key aims and who did they do the research with at what time, how many people they did the research with and so forth. So there's a lot of, just for one data set, it's an enormous amount of documentation you've got to plough through.
Yeah.
Then there are all the papers that the originating team have produced, and that's a lot of reading to go through.
And just to say, these are often behind an access wall, aren't they, as well?
The data sets are often behind, you have to register. I mean, qualitative data are unique, aren't they? Because I mean, you know, people talk about qualitative data being people's names and ages in these big panel surveys. And for you and I, that language is completely foreign, because qualitative data for us is when someone tells you.
Saturated with personal.
Wow, I mean, you know, we've got all about bereavement, divorce, domestic violence, poverty, raising kids and things. You can't get more, you know, depth human than the data that are in the Timescapes archive. You just can't. So there are all sorts of access controls and legally binding contracts that you sign about how you're using those data and ethically and ethics, all of these sorts of
that in another video, but we'll
do another video on that. But that's quite time consuming as well. Then all we were talking about the metadata, all the papers that people have produced and coming up to speed with what was done with that project. And then it might be having conversations with the researchers themselves about the data, and that can be, I mean, it was 6 to 8 months, wasn't it, that you're in your ECR Leverhulme Fellowship, using 2 data sets in the Timescapes archive, talking to the team members. That first phase, it took you at least 8 months, didn't it?
Yeah. So I called it a familiarization phase. I worked with subsamples of data as well, so I didn't even work with the whole data sets of studies, because it would have, you know, for one person, it is time consuming, and I did have to draw on the resources of other researchers to support me in that process. So it does take that time and investment, certainly.
It really does, and so you need signposting into data. So if you're going to be doing. So one of the things of this is the challenges of qualitative secondary analysis for dissertation students, isn't it? This is one of the thoughts that we had, is that it's like, actually, you do need to know what's there and have expert guidance to particular portions of data within the time frame of a dissertation. You need that. You can't just sit there and think, oh, I'll find some data somewhere in the world, because you know, you'll open your laptop or your computer and you'll be absolutely overwhelmed with it all, and finding your way, navigating your way through to the data that you actually are going to use is a long, time consuming process, and it requires a lot of setup.
And I think that's the same for any researcher, actually. You know, just thinking about kind of my project as an ECR, there's no way that I would have just been able to have plucked data out of thin air to be able to do that. So I had you as a mentor. You knew there was data there. You were very familiar with the Timescapes archive, and those conversations were really germane to that work, and were essential, if you like, for supporting that process. And I did really need to do that work collaboratively. I think to do it in the timeframes that I was able to do it in. And we're still doing it now, aren't we? 6 years down the line, we're still analysing and publishing on this data.
On the data.
And
on how we're doing it as well, reflecting on how we're doing it, because it's it's not this straightforward plucking out data and repurposing it in a very straightforward sort of way. Natalie Malviner has this lovely phrase that she uses in a chapter that she wrote in 2010. And she talks about an interview as the digital fingerprint of the research and the researchers and the participant. That it's something which is it's very distinctive to a particular set of interactions at a given period of time. And that needn't constrain how we use an interview or what it is that we can analyse in that interview. But getting to grips with that, that Sarah Irwin and Mandy Winterton talk about the getting to grips with, the contextual embeddedness of data. Getting to grips with that fingerprint, that sort of, really distinctive fingerprint is time consuming. It really is. Knowing how and why and where and what, and then analysing data, because I don't think I know any qualitative researcher who at the end of a study has walked away and said, I've done everything I wanted with those data.
No.
Everyone, I've been in this game for quite a long time now, and throughout the entirety of my academic life, people have ended research studies saying, it ended too soon. I had so much more that I could say on that, but I've now got to get on to the next thing. People always leave their data with so much more to do and say.
I don't know if this is, I've got no backup for this whatsoever, but I don't know where it came from, but
do it.
Doing my PhD, I think someone said that you only ever really publish about 5% worth of your data. I mean, we challenged that completely now because in a previous video we talked about how much you can use data to say so many different things. But something like you use such a small percentage of data, and your analysis is only ever partial.
But it's the one person that only uses so much at that given moment in time, isn't it? And I think what you and I are talking about are successive generations of researchers going back to a particular data set and being able to use it in lots of different ways and never being able to exhaust that data set. You can't possibly exhaust it. It's 20 interviews. The interviews don't change. They were taken, they were produced at a given moment in a particular study. But but I don't think that those data, in a sense, can ever be properly exhausted. There will always be something new to look at, depending on where in time you are and what questions you're bringing to it. But I agree with you in terms of what you're capable of in the moment. Because for me, one interview, to read it, and admittedly, I'm a really slow reader. really, really, really slow. It keeps me. Maybe I just read deep, and I perhaps that's a good thing to tell myself rather than gosh, you're slow. But it takes me about, I come back to it and everything like that. But I mean, I can whip through an interview in a couple of hours. But to analyse an interview, 1 hour of an interview, might take me about 3 weeks. Where I'm going through. It's really, and I'm thinking about an interview that I'm analysing at the moment for a project that you and I are doing. And I'm going through someone's interview, a woman's interview, about the care that the support that she gets from various family members, and it's one of the midlife grandmothers, and about who's involved. And it's only in one of a series of 4 interviews, so interviews that were collected over a period of 4 years. So only one of those interviews where she's talking about who is involved in her life, and I'm only looking at the men. and I'm colour coding the men in the interviews. So, you know, the son is orange and the uncle is this colour and the father is this colour and so forth. And I'm going through, and maybe I've colour coded a paragraph, and then I'll go to the beginning of that paragraph and look through it, and there'll be men that I've missed. And that has shocked me at how much detail I miss, even on close reading. You know, I personally think that, particularly for dissertation purposes, you shouldn't be looking for more than 4 or 5 interviews anyway, really. I mean, I don't know how you're going to handle them. And so the time thing is about, how do you get to those 4 or 5 interviews? How do you choose those to take forward for your dissertation? That's the challenge.
I mean, there are examples, aren't there, of there's the Novella group, I think based at the University of Southampton, and they've done narrative inquiry, and basically they all analysed one small aspect of one transcript, and again the multiple perspectives that produced on that data, and you know, they're coming to it with differently orientated based on their own research interests, you know, just again goes to show how much you can glean from just a small section of data, and how much you can, you know, develop knowledge around that. I think just one thing, you know, this video is about kind of, we're thinking about challenges, but I think what always happens when we have conversations about challenges is we always come back to what Jennifer Mason talks about, which is an investigative epistemology. So the debates kind of focus very much on whether we should do this, and they have shifted to how we do this and kind of approach we take to that. And I think that's where our conversations always end up is, you know, yes, we sort of recognise there are challenges, but then we also think through, but what does that tell us about epistemology, about qualitative methodology and qualitative data and its value, and all those kinds of things. So one of the questions we get a lot again is probably around sort of misinterpretation of data, you know, and what happens if you misread data? Can you develop interpretations of data that completely misrepresent the person and what they were trying to say? What do you think?
I think there's 2 ways of looking at it. So there's one which is, yes, of course you can. And one of the reasons for that is that when I think reading is as active as writing, for example. So when we read transcripts, we're reading into it according to our whole disciplinary perspective, the interests that we have. And so that absolutely frames what it is that we see in those data. We read in theories, we read in findings from other things that we have done. So as individual readers, I think that we read in an awful lot, and I think that really can lead to a misreading because of the sorts of tones of voices that maybe we ourselves are bringing to particular transcripts, or the sorts of, you know, Susie Weller talks about how in secondary analysis that one becomes more emotionally attached to data that one hasn't gathered oneself, because we become very familiar with those participants over a long period of time, and that we develop emotional connections.
Even without meeting them or knowing what they look like
or what they're about,
completely disembodied.
Absolutely. But for me, the point there is or one of the points of what I think is a very, you know, complex and sophisticated set of arguments is that we read in with an emotional tenor. We always read with an emotional tenor. I think that's the other thing. So that when people say things, they have emotional resonance for us as well, which is very much bound up in our own biographies. And I think that's been quite, I think the Novella group is that example that you use, they established that quite beautifully. But I think that how we move beyond an individual reading in that way, or misreading, we've got a number of options, is that we read across the transcripts, so we can actually understand how it is that people more commonly are responding to a particular set of questions when approached according to their particular set of circumstances. So that often research is done with people in similar circumstances, or perhaps, you know, maybe in divergent circumstances, in order to interrogate how these questions play out. So we'll read across a number of transcripts, and that will help us situate transcripts in relation to each other. But also, if we engage properly and we've been reading the papers that the originating researchers have produced on the basis, we'll often quite recognise a participant from some of the data extracts that they use. We'll recognise and we'll understand what their reading of that participant was and how they were framed in the context of the original research. And I think also, because we go back to a transcript repeatedly as well, that as our understanding of our questions and their responses in this broader evidentiary context changes and develops over time, that again, that reading will adjust and whatever. I also think that question additionally requires us to understand what an interview can and can't tell us. So this idea of misreading is, I think, potentially underscored by questions of authenticity. How authentic was that voice, and how far from the truth is our understanding or hearing or listening to that voice? And we know, and you and I have written about this, how, you know, the research encounters are themselves, you know, multiply produced, they're multiply mediated in a whole range of ways, through asking of questions, recording them, and so on and so forth, and eliciting very specific sorts of accounts according to particular interests in the research. So accounts are mediated in particular ways, but also so are reading of them. And really, I think the task in qualitative secondary analysis is to acknowledge and recognise those forms of mediation, and taking that additional step back and critically engaging with that. So being less concerned
with reflexivity around how you apprehend data.
Absolutely. Yeah, how you understand this to be what sort of evidence, or, you know, this is, you know, what sorts of questions can these data speak to?
Yeah.
You know, what accounts or explanations are made possible through this interview as a particular form of evidence. And I mean, we're getting now into epistemics here, you know, and theories of knowledge and so on and so forth. But I think that's exactly the strength of qualitative secondary analysis, is that they put those sorts of questions right at the beginning of a study, whereas often people might either shrug them off entirely or deal with them retrospectively, or just sort of glide over them quite often. You know, they don't deal with them, confront them directly. I think in qualitative secondary analysis, that's one of your first jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How am I treating this as evidence?
Yeah, I think we'll conclude this video here, because we've talked a little bit about challenges, but again, as mentioned, you know, all of our conversations tend to lead to, you know, well, the so what, and what does this tell us about qualitative methodology more generally. In follow-up videos, we will talk in a bit more detail about some of the practicalities of working with data, but also about the ethics, I think, of working with data. And we get asked about ethics all the time. And one way we're really trying to theorize the ethics of QSA is through developing an ethical temporal sensibility, and that really underscores a lot of our thinking as well. So we'll post you to that once the video is done. So thanks for that, Karin.
Thank you, Anna.